Yeah, what are they? Good afternoon. I'm Scott Cherry, your host for the final 2 lectures of the Locke and Lewis lecture series for Holy Week or Passion Week. Yesterday was Easter Sunday, so today is a very special day in the sequence of events that we've been commemorating in the life of Christ. And I'm about to introduce you to Christian Ledford. He gave the first talk last week on the subject of the futility of nihilism. We've asked him to come and present that again and give us a longer version. So if you're a student here at U of M Dearborn, we want you to tune in to the live stream in our Facebook page and on YouTube. You may be friends with Christian, or you may be a fellow classmate with him, as am I. And I'm excited to hear Christian present this material on the futility of nihilism. Christian is one of the brightest young men that I've encountered, and I think you would agree. So, Christian, come and address us, please.
Thank you for this very warm introduction, Scott. It's an honor to be here again to have another opportunity to represent my initial talk for the Locke and Lewis lecture series, like Scott said, on the futility of nihilism. Why humanity has a better hope. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Nihilism is the belief that life has no inherent meaning or purpose and is therefore meaningless overall. Nihilism often results in the rejection of all religious beliefs or objective moral standards. Basically, nihilists think that there's no point that we're here. There's no point to why we're here. We have no inherent purpose in our existence. Nihilism is often synonymous with existentialism, which also involves throwing off all outward moral or societal standards. The most well-known nihilist is probably Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote works such as Beyond Good and Evil in 1886, On the Genealogy of Morals in 1887, and The Antichrist in 1895. Now, Nietzsche's most well-known, or perhaps in Christian circles, infamous phrase is, "God is dead," written most famously in his work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, written between 1883 and 1891. This phrase wasn't Nietzsche saying that God was alive and he was killed by some physical means, but rather that God never existed at all, and as we progress as a society through modernism and postmodernism, the idea of God was now unnecessary for human existence. Some quotes that kind of express the meaning of nihilism by Friedrich Nietzsche, who we just discussed. He said, "There are no facts, only interpretations." William Shakespeare, who wasn't a nihilist but wrote in Macbeth, "Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." And then, maybe most frankly and bluntly put by Cormac McCarthy in the novel No Country for Old Men, the point is that there ain't no point. Now, atheism, put most simply, is a lack of belief in any deity, God, or higher spiritual power, and the following assertion that these things do not or cannot exist. Atheism is the fullest possible expression of agnosticism, which asserts that knowledge of the existence of gods or a god is essentially unknowable and cannot ever be determined for certain. Meanwhile, anti-theism is the fullest expression of atheism, which uses the foundation of the inward personal unbelief in gods or a god to wage an outward opposition to all religion, organized or otherwise. In our current time, anti-theism is prominently referred to as new atheism, and we see prominent atheists such as Christopher Hitchens, who wrote the work God is Not Great, Sam Harris, who wrote the work The End of Faith, and maybe most infamously to us, Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion. Atheism has more or less existed since the beginning of religion itself, and prominent atheistic thinkers have existed throughout all time, but these are the most prominent atheistic thinkers of our time. Some quotes on atheism, but one by Richard Dawkins is, "A delusion is something people believe in despite a total lack of evidence." Another quote from Robert M. Persig is, "When one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it is called religion." And the last quote from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, "Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too?" Basically, The fundamental thing behind atheism is doubt. Doubt that God exists and an assertion that he does not exist based on this doubt. That's the most basic assumption of atheism. Now, atheism and nihilism are not inherently synonymous, and most often they're not synonymous for those who are atheists and those who practice atheism. Millions and millions of atheists live their lives of doubt without throwing off all moral standards or maintaining that life is meaningless. Atheism in and of itself is not the rejection of all morality, nor the assertion that life is pointless. And while most atheists are not nihilists, the overwhelming majority of nihilists are atheists. And this comes into my main point of my talk today, that while atheism inherently is not nihilism, a full extension of the principles and logic of atheism demands nihilism. In a worldview where nothing has any true higher meaning, nothing can have any higher meaning outside of simple existence in and of itself. This leads to something that I call scientific atheism. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of the Species, his for more or less his magnum opus and the foundation of evolutionary biology as we know it. A lot of Christians and a lot of theists like to point to this publication of the Origins of the Species as the point at which religion and science separated from each other forever, but this actually began in the century preceding Darwin, where thinkers of the Enlightenment threw off typical theistic and intelligent design theories of the world and its operation in lieu of more secular and non-theistic interpretations. Today, after centuries of secular scientific thought on biology, geology, and cosmology, science has largely left religion behind. Scientists, like I said, use means outside of God to explain the universe. They use means outside of God to explain why we're here and what the purpose of life is. Those who express skepticism in these new theories are referred to as science deniers. They're referred to as stupid, as unintelligent, and genuinely looked down upon by atheistic members of the scientific community. According to scientific atheism, it's by pure chance that the planet we live on exists perfectly in our sun's habitable zone, which allows liquid water, an utter necessity for life, to exist abundantly on the Earth's surface. Everything else about life, how humans operate, how humans are built, how humans are constructed, is also left up to chance. The orbit of the moon around the Earth is simply a matter and a culmination of chance. Everything that we count as a matter of existence is not here by some design, but rather because the random chance of evolution deemed it necessary to be here. And this largely gets divided into several areas. In biology, life has no inherent value aside from being the pinnacle of evolutionary chance and luck. Humanity is not the pinnacle of terrestrial life as claimed by Christianity and other religions, but instead simply one species of millions and millions and millions that happened to survive when others didn't. Sentience and therefore species consciousness, things that undeniably make us human and superior to any other life observed in the observable universe, they aren't some gift that God has given us. They aren't some supernatural ability that God has breathed into us, but rather simply a culmination of this evolution that has produced us. A quote by Carl Sagan says, "There is no reason to think that the evolutionary process has stopped. Man is a transitional animal. He is not the climax of creation." If you look at this chart about the phylogenetic tree that I've added on this slide, humanity is just simply one jumping off point from the start of this phylogenetic tree that happened to become more powerful and superior to all these other species. It wasn't due to intention. It wasn't due to some divine intervention or providence. It was simply a matter of random, lucky chance. In society with all its advancements, culture, morals, and ethics is not something that's an expression of higher bestowed principles or abilities, but is instead something that's an expression of, like I said before, our evolutionary prowess that we've achieved by chance. The only reason why we don't see, say, a dolphin society, an ape society, a canine society, any other creature society that you can name is simply because we're more evolved than these species. Potentially, given time, we could see societies emerge from these species, but we just haven't yet. In the scale of history of the Earth, human society is not only nothing special, but, according to a lot of rhetoric of the people who hold this view, a detriment and a blight. You see this in a lot of the rhetoric of those who speak about things such as global warming and extinction. And while these things are undeniably bad things, humanity is seen as a net detriment to the Earth. These things aren't simply seen as a byproduct of human society and human nature and human expansion, but rather something that humanity detracts from the world and thusly makes us a net negative for the Earth as we know it. In cosmology, Earth, rather than being the privileged planet that was specifically created by God to house human life and foster our development and experience, it's simply another result of random chance. The Earth was simply produced by an interstellar roll of the dice in galaxy formation. Additionally, human life on the universal scale is not special and not unique, and we should be seeing this elsewhere. We should be seeing in every planet that exists in a galaxy that has the potential for life. We should be seeing life. And this is actually addressed in something called the Fermi paradox. This paradox basically says that, like I said, we should be seeing this life elsewhere. We should be seeing life everywhere in the observable universe. So why aren't we? If life is truly dependent on a certain set of conditions that undoubtedly exist everywhere in the observable universe, why aren't we seeing other life? Why haven't we been contacted by other life? And this paradox poses the kind of contrary viewpoint that it must be because they're not out there. And if you see this diagram that I've added as well, it shows how rather than our solar system and our galaxy being one specific privileged point, it's simply a natural result of galactic formation as a whole. And this, of course, boils down to morality as a whole. Of course, morality is an artifice that holds no higher meaning in this view. Morality comes not from a higher source such as God, but rather as an expression of the needs of a continually evolving human community. We ban things such as murder not because we have an absolute standard that murder is wrong, but because we want to develop a society that succeeds because people don't murder each other. We don't adapt rules such as the outlawing of theft because it's wrong to steal another person's property. We adapt these things because societies are better when we don't let people steal from each other, and societies are more stable when we ban things that infringe on other people's property. In this sense, objective morality is impossible to determine scientifically because mere methods of natural observation, mere methods of just adding numbers together, they don't provide you with this morality that comes from a higher being and a higher purpose. They provide you with shifting morality that comes from situations rather than principles. And this means that objective morality cannot exist. It's not necessarily scientific atheism's reliance on chance that's disturbing, but like I said, it's the implications of this chance that lead it to being nihilistic. If our understanding of the universe can only rest on nature and its laws, i.e. gravity, thermodynamics, things of that nature, what does this implicate for decidedly non-natural things such as morality, such as truth, such as principles, such as rights? It means that there's no absolute moral truth in these things. It means that there's no absolute morality, there's no absolute philosophy on natural rights, and there's no concrete definition of what it means to have human morality and be a human being. Like I said before, in a universe where there is no meaning, nothing can have meaning, least of all our short and significant lives. As far as I'm concerned, this is the fundamental problem of atheism and the fundamental factor that leads to me considering atheism in line with nihilism. If there is no God, no absolute judge of right and wrong, no designer of our lives, and no scribe of our purpose, then we're all governed simply by nature, and in natural governance, anything goes. This ties into theories such as survival of the fittest. If the weak will suffer and the strong will survive, then what guilt is required from either party? If you killing someone and taking their property is simply an expression of the evolutionary ideal of survival of the fittest, then is there any guilt required from that? Do we have any obligation to human beings other than ourselves if we rely on atheism and nihilism? Do we have any obligation to a higher human purpose outside of what we deem our own purpose to be? And I think that this line of thinking says not. And finally, we have death. Even if you ignore everything I said before, even if we discount everything I said before, death is the fundamental difference between theism and atheism. Death is the great unifier. In atheism, death is nothingness. Our deaths are but a slide into eternal oblivion, a complete failure to exist at all. In this sense, atheism has no hope for those suffering in our life. If you're living under oppression, there's no hope for justice. There's no hope for peace in the next life. There's simply only death in and of itself. And this is what death is. Death is nothingness. Like I said, death is a failure to exist on any level, whether sensory, physical, or spiritual. You just aren't anymore. And this is where we set up the juxtaposition between religion and atheism. And what is the purpose of religion in our society? If we look at religion from a neutral point of view, looking at the benefits versus the negatives, of outweighing where the benefits of religion outweigh the benefits of atheism, we see three main factors. First, that religion sets and enforces objective moral standards that have concrete definitions and boundaries. In addition to these concrete and defined moral laws, there are also established consequences for either following or breaking these laws. According to atheism and nihilism, like I said, there can be no truly objective moral standards. In a world where everything's random, morality is random as well, and only suitable for evolving needs. Whereas in the view of religion and the view of theism, we have definite moral standards that stand the test of time and do not change based on our surroundings. Next, religion gives definite and definable hope to those who adhere to it. Atheists and nihilists assert that in addition to life having no objective meaning or purpose, there is no existence after death, like we said, and therefore no ultimate justice nor any ultimate reward. Religion, on the other hand, asserts the eternal nature of both spiritual existence and the human consciousness and sets definite destinations, punishments, and rewards for those who live their lives according to morality, as well as those who live in spite of it. If you forsake yourself and you live in accordance with these higher religious principles, you have a reward in the afterlife. If you don't, if you live for yourself, you live in spite of morality, there's a punishment for you in the afterlife. And lastly, religion drives human beings to live their lives in pursuit of good. While there can be truly no objective greater good under atheism and nihilism, religion not only provides this objective greater good, but directs its adherents into practicing it. For Christianity, for example, forsaking yourself in pursuit of the betterment of others is the primary virtue behind a Christian living. You give up your property, you give up your own well-being, occasionally giving up your life so that the lives of other people can be bettered. And this is undeniably something that impacts billions and billions and billions of lives on a global scale throughout human history. We see Christian charity, we see religious outreaches to help others as some of the driving force of personal betterment of the lives of others, and something that we don't see a purpose for, nor something that's ascribed under atheism and nihilism. In the end, there's no hope for man in detached atheistic science. Therein lies only meaninglessness and despair. For all their vast knowledge, scientists like Richard Dawkins, like we mentioned, miss the painfully obvious. The fact that humanity needs truth and purpose that comes in the form of only one thing, God. However, I'm not speaking of a general, maybe pantheistic or deistic God, but rather the God of the Bible, Yahweh. A generic God may allow for some form of order and species cooperation, but as we've seen in mythological deities throughout history, this God may or may not actually have humanity's higher interest at heart, interests such as truth, love, happiness, and divine purpose. While it's possible that a generic God may wish for humanity to flourish, other belief systems see them only doing that so he or she could exploit them for their divine interest alone. We see this in mythological deities such as the Greek gods and Zeus, or the Norse gods and Odin, mythological supreme deities that are characterized in this way. The properties of the true God are none other than the God that we worship, the utterly unique God of the Bible. He alone declared himself as father to the fatherless and took control of human beings not as slaves, not as servants, but as his offspring, as his actual children. And to those who believe in this, were promised cohabitation with Christ for all of eternity. The God of the Bible uniquely demonstrates his love by raising the crucified Christ from the dead, never to fall victim to the pains of death again. All the other would-be prophets of other religions, all the other would-be gods have not conquered death in the way that our God has, in the form of Jesus' sacrifice and resurrection. Through this, God showed that human beings were not intended for death or decay, and certainly not intended for the hopelessness that atheistic nihilism provides. Instead, human beings were intended for the most purposeful, joyful, and extended life imaginable. For Yahweh, the resurrection of his only Son was his most supreme act of purpose. And we see this idea spread throughout the entirety of the Bible, from Old Testament to New Testament. In Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, when speaking to the prophet Jeremiah, God says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." Instead of being just a result of chance, instead of our existence being something that happened simply because an amount of numerical factors added up in the right order, God has ordained our existence from the day we were conceived. He knows knows the day that we're born, and he knows the day that we're going to die. And this is some certainty that you cannot see outside of Christianity. Also, in Romans chapter 10, verses 13, we read that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Whereas in a secular set of subjective morality, we don't see any ultimate reward. We don't see any ultimate punishment. We don't see any ultimate justice. This is notably something we see in Christianity. Whereas in our world, if we can't atone for our own sins without God. In the world of simply pure reason, pure logic, pure scientific and mathematical statistics, nothing we do can atone for the things that we've done wrong. If we violate the rights of others, if we hurt people, that's not something that we can overcome on our own. That's not something we can undo. But the sacrifice of Christ makes it so that through Christianity, this is something that we can overcome. Instead of us trying to undo our own misdeeds on our own, Christ has undone our own misdeeds by himself. His blood from his sacrifice on the cross has washed away our sins and given an absolution that cannot be found outside of his sacrifice. In Luke 23, verses 39 through 43, we see this precisely with the story of the thief on the cross. One of the criminals who were hanged there on the cross was hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other answered and rebuking him said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." Because of the sacrifice of Jesus, no matter what we've done, we can hope for eternal salvation and cohabitation with Christ. We don't have much information in the Bible about this thief that was hanging on the cross next to Jesus, about this repentful thief, but we can assume that he did things that were worthy of crucifixion. Maybe he was a rapist, maybe he was a murderer, maybe he was a thief, maybe he was an awful human being who never did a single right thing in his entire life. But because of Christ, his single last act of faith and repentance ensured that he would, as Christ said, be with him in paradise and not be doomed to the eternal death that is hell. And this applies for everyone. Everyone who's sinned, everyone who's fallen short of the glory of God, we can hope for an eternity with Christ because of the non-discriminatory sacrifice of Christ. If we repent and we humble ourselves, we see that we have a hope that does not exist inside of atheism or nihilism. We have a hope for our future. We have a hope that our evil acts and misdeeds will be absolved, that we will be forgiven. And this is the fundamental thing that gives hope in Christianity, and this is why humanity has a better hope than the futility of atheism and nihilism. Thank you.
Just tell him when to press the button. Oh, I said just tell David when exactly to press the YouTube button.